Thank you for coming to our talk. So my name is Gorka Irazoki, and we're going to explain today cache side channel attacks. We're going to explain how to exploit them, where can they be applied, and then how you can prevent them. So before starting to speak about them, let us introduce ourselves. So as for myself, I'm a PhD candidate in Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts. My PhD has mostly been focused on microarchitectural attacks in general, but we mostly focused in the cloud and lately in other scenarios. And yeah, I was also an intern at Intel during last summer, and that's where I met Xiaofei, who's going to present himself now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Xiaofei Guo. I am currently working as a technical lead at Cisco Tetration Analytics. So for those of you who are not familiar with Tetration, we build products that provide full visibility of the data center in real time. And we also provide automated and dynamic policy generation and enforcement. So before that, I used to work at Intel Security Center for Excellence and also Qualcomm's product security group, where I used to work on IoT and mobile platform security, infrastructure security, and also application security. And before that, I was a PhD student at NYU, and where I used to spend most of my time analyzing system behaviors. So before we start the talk, just a quick disclaimer. We don't speak for our employer. All the opinions and information here are our responsibility, including the mistakes and bad jokes.
Cool, so let's start speaking about cache attacks, right? And what are cache attacks for me? The way I see them is just the approach that an attacker would take to actually attack the log that we see in the screen. Well, an attacker has many options to attack this, right? He can either implement a brute force attack, he can try different passwords, like stupid passwords. If he's very sophisticated, he can even insert hardware Trojan inside that and try to see what kind of keys have been pressed. A side channel attacker would implement another approach, right? So basically what he would try to do is he would try to find some other traces that the utilization of this security solution leaves and try to take advantage of those, right? So cache attacks are kind of the same, but instead of fingerprints, what we utilize is the cache utilization. So, but this is hardly believable, right? So the fact that just by knowing the cache utilization you are able to recover cryptographic keys and this kind of stuff, it's at least a bit unrealistic, or it wasn't realistic. But since we have been doing many work in realistic scenarios like clouds, smartphones, and trusted execution environments, etc., these attacks are becoming more and more realistic, and also are being echoed by the news. And further, security software started to update their security features as well in response. So we're seeing that finally these kind of attacks are getting the attention that they deserve. But it hasn't been like that since they exist, right? So in fact, cache attacks existed since 2005, where these two beautiful attacks were implemented, right? Recovering AES and RSA keys, but the issue is that they were attacking actually core private resources, and further they lacked of kind of a scenario in which they could be applied practically. But luckily in 2013 we started seeing attacks that were applicable across cores, right? First with the duplication, then without the duplication, then across CPUs, across CPU sockets, and finally in mobile devices, right? So we see the amount of work that has been done in the last 3 years, in the last 3-4 years, and also how we increase the practicality on this. And actually, if we see the trend, I'm expecting this to even grow more in the next years. So I'm expecting these attacks to be applied also in even more realistic scenarios. But let's see how they work, right? So the first thing to define here is what a cache is, right? A cache is just mainly a fast memory that you put, a fast and small memory that you put between the CPU and the main memory, such that you don't have to access the main memory all the time, which would be really slow. But instead you access this cache, which actually holds data that is likely to be accessed soon, and you access it pretty fast. But we have systems nowadays that have several levels of cache, right? As we see in the picture. The question is, which one do we pick for attack, right? And indeed, what we see, the main difference between the level 1 and level 2 cache and the last level cache is actually that the last level cache is usually shared across cores, so that's a good thing because we can attack across cores and not only if we are core collocated. Further, the last level cache also usually exhibits the inclusiveness property usually. So this means that any data that exists in the upper level caches will exist in the last level cache. And also we have a high resolution in the last level cache. So basically, if we want to distinguish a last level cache access and a main memory access, it will be much easier than distinguishing a level 1 and level 2 access. So having identified our target, so let's try to see how it works, right? So how do cache attacks work nowadays? How do caches work nowadays, sorry. So mainly we have set associative caches. That means that caches are divided into equally sized partitions called sets, and the location of a particular memory block in the cache is going to be decided by the physical address, right? So basically, you as a user will see the virtual address, but this will get translated into a physical address that will be divided into 3 main fields: the cache tag, the set, and the byte field. And the byte field actually selects the byte in which you're going to be positioned in the same cache line. The set field will select the set to occupy in the cache, and the cache tag will be used to compare. So for us, the important one is going to be the set number, because that's the one we're going to utilize to create contention. So now that we know how more or less they work, let's try to see what can we do or how can we attack them, right? And the first attack that showed up, right, in the last level cache was the flash and reload attack, which actually is requires 2 main things to work. The first one, that we have memory duplication, so that we have some kind of mechanism in the system that allows us to, or that allows users to share memory pages, identical and read-only memory pages. So instead of having wasted copies of read-only memory pages, the system will share them, such that both parties access the same physical memory page. And although this might seem threatening and might seem unrealistic, the truth is it's implemented actually by default in Linux, in KVM, of course. In VMware, it was implemented by default, but we actually notified them about our findings, about how can we utilize this to actually do damage, and they actually gave us this CB number, and they disabled it, and now it's not implemented by default. And lastly, we see it in Android as well with the C-code mechanism. And the second requirement is actually that you have a flash instruction in the instruction set architecture. So meaning that you actually need an instruction in instruction set architecture that allows you to evict something from the cache. So if you meet these 2 requirements, the way you can attack this is in the following way. So basically, let's say you have a red memory block that you share with a victim and that you want to know how it's being utilized, right? So mainly what the attacker first does is just flash that memory block from the cache, meaning that he will utilize the set instruction from the instruction set architecture to actually flash the memory block from the cache. Then he's going to wait until the victim, for some cycles, until the victim, or to see whether the victim makes or doesn't make an access. If she does make an access, she will put it back, she will put the memory block back in the cache. And now the attacker re-accesses the flashed memory block. If he sees a fast access time, it means that the victim accessed the memory block because he's retrieving it from the cache. If not, he will actually figure out that the victim didn't use the memory block while he was waiting. So this is a quite restrictive attack, right? But what do we gain? Of course, it has many advantages, right? The first one is that it's low noise. So basically, it's very resistant to noise, meaning that we're only dealing with 1 memory block. We're actually only flashing and reloading 1 memory block. And that means that if some noisy process in the system wants to create, or is willing to create noise, he will have to fill an entire set to create a noisy access. And that's quite a lot. The second advantage is that, surprisingly, it's applicable across CPU sockets. Why? Because the flash instruction doesn't only flash from the last level cache, but also invalidates the memory block, and that will provoke that other CPU sockets also invalidate the memory block from their cache hierarchy. And further, since we have some fast links between CPUs to retrieve data faster from another CPU socket's cache, this attack is fully applicable across CPU sockets. And also, for the same reason, we don't require the inclusiveness property in this one, because the invalidation will invalidate the block even in non-inclusive caches. So in the disadvantages side, the requirements might be hard to achieve in some scenarios. So for example, in commercial clouds, usually memory duplication is not implemented. Or for example, in most mobile devices, the flash instruction is not available from user space. And also, it can only recover statically allocated data. What do we mean by this? We can only recover statically allocated data and code. So basically, things like dynamically allocated data that goes to the heap, we cannot recover information from them with this attack. Mainly because it depends on memory duplication. So now that we see we have seen the most restrictive attack, let's see, what happens if we start relaxing assumption, right? What happens if we don't have such a flash instruction in the instruction set architecture? Well, can we still attack? Probably yes, right? The only thing we just need is to actually fill the set in which the memory block resides, right? And how can we do that? Remember that the location of a memory block in the cache will depend actually on the physical address. And it turns out that this offset part of the virtual to physical address translation doesn't get translated. The issue is that the offset, the number of bits in the offset is actually quite low for regular pages. And therefore, we don't gain enough information about the location of our memory block in the last cell cache. However, we can actually increase the offset. How? Utilizing huge pages, right? So this will give us enough information about where the memory blocks that we want to utilize to fill the set are going to go into the cache. So once we have that, the only thing we have to do is just, if the memory block is here, we just create additional memory blocks that will actually fill the set. And actually, they will evict the red memory block. Now we're going to wait as attackers again to see whether the victim access or doesn't make an access to the red memory block. If she does, she will put it back in the cache again. And as before, we again reload, right? And we reload only the red memory block, remember. And actually, if it has been utilized by the victim, we will get access to it quite fast. If not, we will see that it takes a slow time. So what did we gain with this, right? So mostly we gained the fact that, we're applicable in most processors, in the processors without the flash instruction. For example, ARM processors, right? We only know one smartphone that actually has this flash instruction implemented from user space. And in the con side, we still can only target statically located memory. We're still dealing with LLC slices. We are dealing with LLC slices. This means that in Intel, for example, the cache is actually not only divided into sets, but also into slices that are selected with an undocumented function. But luckily, there are many works that have reverse engineered this function, and we can actually predict where our data will go. Also, it only works with inclusive caches, as we don't have any flash instruction now to invalidate data, but we just rely on evictions. And for the same reason, it only works in the same CPU socket. All right, what if we relax the second assumption, right? What if we don't want to rely on shared memory pages, right? What can we still do? We certainly cannot just predict now the utilization of a particular memory block, but what we can do is predict the utilization of a particular set in the cache. How do we do this? We mainly are going to fill the cache as before with our own memory blocks. We pick a set in the cache and we fill it. Then again, we wait until the victim does or doesn't make an access to that set. If she does, she will have to put her own memory block for which we don't have access into the cache, and she will have to evict one of our memory blocks. And now we reaccess our 12 memory blocks again. And what we will see is that 11 of them come from the cache, and the last one comes from the memory, right? So meaning that someone utilized the set that we are priming. So this is actually called the prime and probe attack. And the advantages of it, it's basically that, first of all, it doesn't need shared memory, and that's actually you can have a broader impact. For example, you can attack things like commercial clouds and so on. So we saw yesterday a talk in which utilized this attack to perform a cover channel. And also it can target both static and dynamically allocated memory. This is important. This is very important because now we can get information about memory that actually is allocated in the heap. And the con side, actually it's noisier than flash and reload and the evict and reload. Why? Because we're dealing with the probe of 12 memory blocks or 16 memory blocks instead of one. We're dealing with LLC slices again. For the same reason as before, it only works with inclusive caches. It only works in the same CPU socket. And further, we need to identify the target set that we want to probe, which is actually can be tricky, but can be done with enough training. Right, we have seen 3 attacks that work in under many different requirements, and what we would like to see also is how can these attacks retrieve information, right? So what you see in the slide is a Montgomery ladder decryption. So the typical decryption that you would do with an RSA operation, right? So mainly the key is E in this case, and it's processed bit by bit. All right? So if the bit is a 0, what we will execute is the first 2 instructions in the branch. If the bit is a 1, we will execute the other 2 instructions. So this doesn't look very good, right? So mainly because it has key-dependent branches, right? So we should avoid this. How would an attack, this is food for cache attacks, actually. So how would a cache attack attack this? So for example, let's pick the second instruction in the first branch. And yeah, so since this is code, the attacker and the victim, if we're in a system that uses memory duplication, we will share this with the victim. So something we can do is basically pick that instruction, flash it beforehand, then let the victim perform 1 iteration in this loop. If she actually is processing a 1-bit or a 0-bit, she will actually have to utilize this instruction that we flashed, and she will have to put it back in the cache. If not, this will not happen. And again, the attacker just reloads there, and what he will see is that, again, if the victim processes a 0-bit, he will see this instruction coming from the cache. If not, he will see the instruction coming from the memory. And therefore, he can actually reverse the zeros and ones pretty easily. This was with flash and reload, but what happens if we actually don't have memory duplication? We're kind of the same thing. The only pre-step that we have to do is identify to which set that instruction goes. But if we have identified that, the only thing we have to do is just fill the set in which that instruction resides. Again, let the victim perform 1 iteration of this loop. If the victim uses that instruction, she will have to put it back in the cache and evict one of our memory blocks. And when we reload our own memory blocks again, what we will see is that if the victim utilized the instruction that we are priming or that we're trying to get information from, we will see that 1 block comes from the memory instead of all from the cache. So that's how we can utilize these 2 attacks to actually get the full RSA key in 2 separate scenarios. So this is kind of the summary of the cons and pros of each of the attacks. So basically, the first 2 require memory duplication, flash and reload and evict and reload require the duplication. The last one doesn't. The flash and reload requires a flash instruction as well. The evict and reload and prime and probe don't. The first 2 only can target the statically allocated memory, and prime and probe can actually target statically and dynamically allocated memory. And the first 2 are very resistant to noise, while prime and probe is not that much that resistant. Cool. So let's see where can we apply this. So basically, these attacks can be executed under the assumption of hardware co-residency, right? So where can we, at least the first scenario that comes to my mind for hardware co-residency is the cloud, right? So pretty much in the cloud it's quite quite easy to actually get to share hardware with another person. You just rent a VM, and you know you'll get to share hardware with another person, right? You don't know who, but we'll talk about that later. So, and although the isolation is pretty well provided at the software level, at the hardware level it's not that well provided, right? And an example of such an attack is the RSA key retrieval that we did in Amazon EC2. So we were able to recover RSA decryption key or secret key across virtual machines in Amazon EC2. So some advantages of this scenario: you get actually to own a virtualized operating system, so you get access to everything that a virtualized operating system provides, right? For example, timers, fine-grained timers, and huge pages. If the duplication is enabled, also all the attacks that we have seen are applicable. If not, only prime and probe is applicable. And in the con side, so the main one for me is that it requires co-residency, or at least it requires co-residency identification. And we will see how can we do this later. And also the high amount of noise that you see in the cloud, because mainly the workloads that you execute in the cloud are much heavier than in other scenarios. So how do we find co-residency, right? Or at least how did we do it for our attack, right? For our RSA attack. So the main thing that we did is, utilize the same information. We again utilized the last of the cache for this, right? So the way we did this is we had the decryption server, RSA decryption server in one VM, and we started spinning other VMs, right? And basically what we did is just issue a request to that decryption server and try to see whether the information that we got from the cache matched what we expect for the RSA decryption server. If it does, then we have co-residency achieved. If not, we have to open more VMs. So we had to actually spend quite a bit of money on this and time, actually. But we finally, with ADVMs, we were able to find a coercient one with the target. And after that, well, what you see there is an example of how RSA trace looks like. So basically, the exponentiations are quite distinguishable from the rest of the trace. And other works actually utilize, for example, memory bus locking attacks for this. Cool. So unfortunately, I don't have the time and to go to Amazon S2 and retrieve an RSA key, but I'm going to show you like how cache attacks can actually bypass the isolation in KVM, for example, right? So what we have here is basically an AES decryption server that is, issuing decryptions with an unknown key. Basically, what you see in the screen is just the so this is AES 128, so we see the 10 round keys, byte by byte. And yeah, it doesn't matter which round key you recover, as long as you recover one, you can reverse it and recover the others. So that's actually what we are going to try to do, right? So we're going to, from the other virtual machine, we're trying to see, we're telling the decryption or encryption server to encrypt packages for us, and then we're trying to see what the cache utilization is, and we're trying to recover the key from there. Yeah, and basically, so yeah, we're going to see results later. Let me first show you what the attack consists on, right? So mainly what we're doing is what you see in the upper slide, right? So AES, let me just, AES utilizes T-tables, or what we call substitution tables, that are key dependent, all right? So basically, the entries that you access in the substitution tables are dependent on the key that you access, that you have. In this case, that's what we are actually exploiting. These tables are shared if you are under memory duplication systems. So yeah, what the problem is that each caching holds more than one table entry. So basically, you cannot recover that much of a fine-grained information. But still, if you run statistics, what you will see is that for certain bytes, the key will be always, well, for certain ciphertext byte values, some table entries will be always used or will be substantially more frequently used than for the others. And that's what we actually do. That's what we exploit for the attack. And if we see, this is the key that we got, and if we compare to the actual key, so what we're trying to retrieve is the last string of bytes that you see it. That's the last round key, and that's what we are trying to recover. So we see that the first bytes are 14, A1, D4, A0. And in this case, I'm printing the 3 most likely candidates for each byte. So we see that the most likely candidate for the first byte is 14, so we got that correctly. The second most likely candidate is A1, which we got that correctly. The third one is D4, which we got that correctly as well, and A4, the same thing. So for example, the fourth byte, we didn't recover it correctly actually, but the other 3, 5, 7, and 8, we recovered correctly actually. 8-4, DA3F, and we see there 8-4, DA3F. So you see, with a better post-processing, of course, all the key bytes will be reliably we would have gotten reliably all of the key bytes, but we got a substantially high number of key bytes correctly actually. So that was quite good. So yeah, we were able to actually recover AES key that should be computationally infeasible with the computational power that we have today. We just utilizing just checking how the hardware utilization was, we were able to recover the key, right? So that's how powerful cache attacks can be. And actually, we did that in less than a minute, right? So that was quite good. So yeah, what else can you apply cache attacks, right? So you can actually apply them as a malicious JavaScript execution. So if you embed that into a JavaScript execution, basically what you will get to do is you will get your target to access your targeted website, or your victim to access the targeted website, and the local browser will actually execute the JavaScript code in his local machine. Yeah, even sandboxed and so on, but still it will get to use the same hardware as the victim, right? So, and that's what we are trying to exploit. An example of this is the incognito browsing profiling that Oren et al. Performed. So they were able to actually retrieve websites that were accessed in incognito mode, right? So that's, again, how powerful these things can be. Some pros that we see in this scenario over the previous one. So first of all, we don't need to find a correct resident target anymore, since the target will actually access our website. So we don't need to bother about that. And also the attack is executed in a local machine, which is actually, for which the workloads are going to be much less heavy than in the cloud. Also, well, in the disadvantages side, flash and reload cannot be applied, as JavaScript is a very high-level language, and actually flash and reload requires very low-level instructions that are not available in JavaScript. And further, fine-grain timers are actually getting harder and harder to achieve, but still there are ways to trick this, but they are not as simple as utilizing a timing counter. Where else can we apply cache attacks, right? So where else can we get to execute things in the same hardware? Well, for example, as smartphone applications, right? So which are supposed to be isolated pretty well by the executed in isolated environment, etc. But again, both applications will execute in the same hardware, and therefore you can get advantage of this to perform a cache attacks. More than that, the main advantage that I see in this scenario is the fact that you can embed an attack into an innocent-looking binary, and basically just get like online repositories not to detect it as malicious, right? So as cache attacks actually don't, or microarchitectural attacks in general don't look that malicious. So yeah, we have seen actually AES key steal across applications in this kind of a scenario. And what we see in this in smartphones is that usually duplication is used. For example, in Android, we're dealing with low RAM devices, right? So it's actually understandable that we want to optimize the memory as much as possible. So we see it in Android with Cgoat. And although we get to share memory with a potential victim, actually we only share core libraries, right? What Cgoat understands by core libraries. So that means that all the rest of the libraries will actually be private to each application. So the duplication is enabled, yes, but we have limited targets on that. And also, for me, it has an easy deployment. As I said before, we get to reach a lot of people just by putting an apparently innocent binary that contains a cache attack in an online repository and convince people to download it. In the con side, as I said before, the flash instruction is actually difficult to find in smartphones, so only Samsung S6 for now that we know has it enabled by user space. Also, we see pseudo-random replacement policies in caches, which actually make things difficult to perform, right? So although they have been reverse engineered, but still they are not as tricky as with Intel devices, for example, or x86 devices. And also the scalability problem, right? So it's very likely that an attack that works in one smartphone will not work in the other one. Why? Because they are very, very dependent on several algorithms that are different across devices, right? For example, we see smartphones that are non-inclusive, some of them that are inclusive, some of them that implement weird features like lockdown, which means that actually you cannot evict anything from any other phone, from any other core, etc. Right? So these kind of things make actually this scenario a little bit harder to attack. And the last one that for me is the most promising one is actually the trusted execution environments, right? So they're becoming very popular with the release of SGX, right? And with the wide adoption of Trust Zone. And basically, again, we're supposed to be isolated from any other, in the trusted execution enclave, we're supposed to be isolated from any other software running in the same hardware. But still, both untrusted and trusted worlds utilize the same hardware, and that means that we still get to actually execute the attacks that we said before, right? Or at least some of them. And in this case, we actually, since we can consider that the operating system is malicious, we can actually do either enclave-to-enclave attacks or host-to-enclave attacks, right? So we have seen actually attacks that perform AES and RSA key recoveries, right, across in these two scenarios. And I said that this is the most promising scenario for me because we have several advantages. I only see one disadvantage, and it's the fact that a high-resolution attack like flash and reload is not applicable because the duplication is actually usually disabled between hardware and between trusted and untrusted worlds. But in the advantages side, I see many, right? So, for example, you get access to resources. The OS can be malicious, and therefore you get access to resources that actually are not present in other scenarios. Also, we don't need to find a corresponding target. We just attack whatever is being run in the enclave. And also further, so you get a limited amount of noise, right? Because you can actually virtually stop the enclave to after every memory access. So the way it would work is you have a malicious operating system that just primes the cache at the beginning. Then we actually let the victim execute one and only, or hopefully one or two memory accesses, and then we stop the victim, right? As the operating system can do that, he can stop the victim after very few memory accesses and now probe the cache again. And therefore, he gets a very high time resolution, which is actually something that you don't get in the other scenarios. Yeah, and now Rex will talk about how can we stop these attacks.
So I hope you guys enjoyed the condensed and comprehensive introduction on the cache attack. And now we're going to switch gears. I'm going to talk about countermeasures. So in my previous role, we've received numerous requests from both internal and external people asking us how to defend against these attacks, especially in the data center segment. So today, we're going to talk about 4 countermeasures that you can actually deploy in your environment. And we'll talk about the constraint and also the security coverage for different countermeasures. Okay. So the first one, the first countermeasure is design leakage-free code. What I mean by leakage-free is that it should have secret independent instruction access, and also it should have secret independent data access. So if an application designer wants to improve their code in such a way that they don't have cache side channel leakage, the first thing they have to do is first, they have to identify the secret that they want to protect from these attacks, right? And then they have to figure out what are the variables that have relationship with this, the secret. So to identify that, right now, people go through a very manual process. Of course, you can try more automated methods, such as taint analysis. And after you you identify the code regions that you want to protect, the next thing you want to do is to evaluate how big the leakage is. And then after you get a confidence about how big the leakage is in your design, then you want to redesign your code and go through an iterative process. But for today, unfortunately, there is no automated way of doing all these flow. And if you're interested, we have some future work that will come up soon, and we're happy to talk to you offline about this. But today we're going to explain how to manually inspect which part of your code have cache side channel leakage, and how do you fix those code. So we'll use a real example. This is the same algorithm that Gorka was showing. This is the RSA modulo exponentiation in the WOOF SSL crypto library. And this is a real CVE. So actually, we find a whole bunch of CVEs in different cryptographic libraries, but we want to pick the specific CVE to explain the cache side channel vulnerability and also how to fix it. Because this example contains a lot of, it is already hardened against remote timing attack, but they are pretty surprised that it's vulnerable to cache timing. So let's get a quick recap about what this algorithm does. The algorithm takes in a base value B and a modulus n, and also a secret E. What it does is it will compute B to the E modulo n, okay? And it initializes 2 variables, R0 equal to 1 and R1 equal to B. After that, it will scan through each key bit. For each key bit, depending on the key bit, it will compute different modulo multiplications. So now I want to test if anybody really listened to the attack part. Can anybody remember why is this code vulnerable to cache timing attack? Anyone? Okay, I'm not going to give you a hard time. So the problem is that, as you can see, there's an if-else condition here, okay? Although there's an if-else condition here, what that means is that when you map this code into the cache, the code region in the if condition and the else condition will be mapping into different cache sets. Now, if the attacker is able to probe different cache sets, then you will know which code region you are actively accessing. So the solution to this type of code style is to merge the if-else condition into a single code region. So as you can see in line 4 and 5, now regardless of what the key value is, we always execute the same instructions. Right? The way we're solving this is by expanding the R variable. Now, based on the R variable, we'll index, based on the key bit value, we'll index back in the R variable. So the next question is this code leakage-free? Well, if I ask, apparently it's not. So there's still a secret-dependent data access. And the reason is this. As you can see in line 5, based on the secret bit EI, we're going to index different location in the R variable. Now, if the key bit is, let's say EI equal to 0, right? Then when we execute line 5, we're going to load R0. And if the key bit is 1, then we're going to access R1. Now, if the attacker is able to measure the time to the cache set that R0 is mapping to, then you can figure out whether the victim program is actively accessing R0 or R1. So similar to the previous case, the attacker can do this iteratively to extract every bit of the RSA key. Okay, then we come up with another improvement. Now we achieve secret independent data access. The way we do it is, regardless of the key bit, we're going to load the whole R variable into the cache. Okay? So just a recap. The two things to keep in mind to design a cache leakage free code is, first, we want to achieve secret independent instruction access. And the way we do it is by merging the different control flows into a single code region. Okay? And the second thing we want to achieve is secret independent data access. And the way we achieve it is, regardless of what the secret value is, we always load the whole data into the cache so that the attacker has no way to figure out which data region we're actually accessing. So the next idea is page coloring. What page coloring means is that the operating system, when you assign pages to processes, it can actually look at the physical address. And then certain physical address bits determine what this page is going to map to in the cache set. Now, then if the operating system can carefully select physical page address in such a way that it can isolate the protected process from the unprotected process. What I mean by that is you can assign page physical addresses to the protected process such a way that all its page map to a certain cache set. And so the third idea is cache allocation technology. This is a fairly new hardware feature. After 2015, Intel announced a new feature called Intel CAT. It provides a hardware framework to lock the cache. So what that means is the operating system or the hypervisor can lock the cache ways for particular processes. So what will happen is, let's say the operating system lock a certain cache way, as shown in the diagram, and then the attacker process comes in and try to say, hey, I'm going to do a prime and probe attack. So he primes the cache, but then the cache way that is protected is already locked. So there's no way the attack process can evict that cache way. So it will do its usual stuff. It will do prime and probe or flush and reload or any attack that we explained previously. But it will get absolutely no information about the side channel because it cannot even influence the cache activity for the protected ways. Now, the straightforward implementation of the Intel CAT has a limitation because the hardware itself only provides isolation for 4 cache sections, which means that you can only protect 4 processes. A way to improve it is to combine page coloring with the Intel CAT technology. So on top of the Intel CAT, you can have the hypervisor to provide a page coloring. So within your each hardware partition, you can create more software partitions. So the last countermeasure I'm going to talk about is behavior detection using hardware performance counters. For those of you who are not familiar with hardware performance counters, these are CPU registers that exist in all the major CPU vendors, and they can track microarchitecture events that happen on your system. So one important thing to keep in mind about these CPU registers is that you can program a certain threshold for these registers. And then once the register counting reaches a certain threshold that you program, it can trigger interrupt back to the operating system. So how do we use to detect a cache attack? Here's an example. There is one hardware event that performance counter can keep track of, which is last level cache miss. Okay. Now, if you look at the last level cache attack trees, you will find a very obvious or very distinguishable behavior, which is you will see a continuous and burst amount of last level cache miss. So one simple way of applying this performance counter-based detection approach is that in the case of hypervisor, the hypervisor can first program the performance counters with a certain threshold that depends on the environment of the system. And once the performance counter reaches this threshold, it will trigger interrupt back to the operating system. And once the operating system sees that interrupt, it can analyze, for example, during a certain amount of a certain time interval, how many last level cache miss happen. And then it can be notified about this kind of activity. But of course, you may, people may say this heuristic is too simple. Maybe there's some legitimate program or some legitimate system that has this kind of behavior at some certain special time. So you can actually improve this by designing a second level detector. So once the performance counter triggers the operating system interrupt, the operating system can come up and actually inspect the memory accesses come from the processor. Now, by examining the memory access, then you can identify whether these kind of access is actually attacker actively flushing the same addresses, or it's a regular program loading or some other kind of regular system behavior. Okay, so we talked about 4 countermeasures, and I want to compare those countermeasures from 2 perspectives. The first one is from a real production deployment perspective. What are the things that are required by these countermeasures? So if we do the countermeasure at the code level, the only thing that we require is source code. But of course, sometimes source code is not available. If we use page coloring, that will require modification to the operating system or the hypervisor. Depends on which level you're implementing it. If we go into use the Intel CAT, the first constraint will be you will need to have a pretty new hardware that has the feature. And also, it will require some operating system update such that you can leverage the Intel CAT feature to provide this kind of isolation. Now, so for behavior detection, whether it requires operating system change depends on the scenario. For example, if you are implementing this in the Linux operating system, there's no need to change the operating system. You can just program a kernel module that can interface with the performance counter. And you can also handle the detection after the performance counter triggered the interrupt. But of course, if you're implementing at the hypervisor level, then it will require a code change in the hypervisor. Now let's see how effective are these techniques against the 4 attack scenarios that Gorka was describing. So if we have leakage-free code, then it will work against all the 4 environments. Now, if we're using page coloring, it will work in the cloud environment, the IaaS and PaaS cloud environment. It will work in the smartphone environment. But whether it works in the JavaScript in the browser really depends on what the JavaScript is attacking. So for example, if the JavaScript is attacking an application outside the browser, yes, then the page coloring will work because it will be able to distinguish between the browser process and the victim process. But if the JavaScript is actually attacking things within the browser, then the page coloring algorithm will not be able to know which page belongs to attacker, which page belongs to victim, since they're all in the same process. So similarly, whether Intel CAT will be effective in this environment is based on one assumption, that the memory deduplication needs to be disabled. Then Intel CAT will work for both the cloud and also smartphone environment. And so one thing for the trust execution environment, page coloring and Intel CAT both will not work in the trust execution environment because it relies on the operating system to provide security. And trust execution environment don't trust the operating system. So it cannot protect the trust execution environment. In the case of behavior detection, it can be applied to the first 3 scenarios, but it won't apply to the trust execution environment either because, again, it relies on trust assumptions on the operating system and hypervisor. Okay, now we come to the conclusion. We talk about all the major cache attacks, and we also talk about all the major computing environments that you can actually use cache attacks. So cache attack may look slightly complicated than some traditional exploitation method, but they're certainly real threats. Now, if your organization really consider cache attack in your threat model, you should consider implementing these countermeasures. Depends on your requirement and constraint. So just to recap, the countermeasure that we talk about is at the application level, you can introduce leakage-free code design. And you can also do page coloring for cache isolation at the operating system or hypervisor level. And at the system level, you can use the operating system or hypervisor to leverage these new hardware features such as Intel CAT or the performance counter. And with that, I thank everybody for attending our talk, and we're ready for questions. So I think that's definitely case by case, but for this specific scenario, that specific example that we talk about, it doesn't affect because we have a way to measure the leakage after the modification. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I will ask you very basic questions because obviously since I was not knowledgeable about this before, my questions will be basic. Okay, so please bear with it. All right. So the first basic question is: so I have an application running, and I'm trying to get data from the cache, which some other application is, writing into the cache. How do I know which cache set should I access?
That's actually a good question. So the issue is that you more or less know what you want to attack. That's actually kind of an assumption that is given, right? So for example, if you want to attack, I don't know, RSA decryptions, you kind of know more or less, or you kind of know what to expect in the set that you want to attack, all right? So,
Say for example,
Yeah.
want to get some user ID passwords from the memory of the IIS server. So
Yeah. So, for example, the cryptographic operation going on in that credential checking, right? So basically, it will leave a trace that you kind of, so you can train your attack in a lab environment, for example, to actually know or how that process behaves more or less in terms of cache. So, for example, you can train with machine learning and so on. You can do things like, well, when I log in, I see certain cache sets that have accesses that look like this, right? So basically, you kind of do that, right? So pretty much, you scan all the sets, looking for those sets that you know that they should behave in a certain way.
okay, hold on. So can my application access all the cache sets across L3?
Yes.
It can access.
Yes.
So basically, what you're saying, I access everything across L3, look at it, and then I look at it again. I look at it again.
Yes.
Again, right? But then how do I know how frequently I have to look so that I get every step and I'm not jumping steps?
Usually that's a threshold again that you can train your application to. So like depends. Again, this is not a yes or no answer. So it's not like you have to look after every 100 cycles, right? So it kind of depends on what you want to attack. So but you can train that. So basically you can train your attack to actually know when to look or how frequently to look to actually see the pattern that you expect. Once you do that, you go to the cloud, to your IaaS, for example, to Amazon S2, for example, and you just scan all the sets with your frequency, the frequency that you train it, the algorithm for, and then you just decide which sets to attack.
So let me add something really quick. The granularity that the attacker access the cache and measure the feedback is normally much smaller than the algorithm that they're trying to attack. So you have a lot of wiggle room about tuning your attack. But of course, if you are really trying to attack a really, really small co-region, then the attack granularity for the feedback may be smaller than how fast the code computes. But we see that's pretty rare, at least from the crypto library perspective. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so just I'm trying to stitch things. So the example you showed that there's an if and there's an else. So basically what you're saying is we would already kind of replicate that in our lab environment and know what happens to the cache sets when there is an if and then there's an else, how it behaves. And we would try to actually scan all the cache sets and see where I'm getting the same kind of behavior.
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, there's definitely a certain, depends on scenario, there's definitely obscurity when we're trying to attack things. But one good example will be SSL. Like everybody uses SSL. Now we profile all the popular SSL libraries and we get the most up-to-date versions. Then we can get a good, how do I say, a signature list. And then when we probe the cache, we know, okay, you're doing this, you're doing this.
It is, what you're saying is true, but you usually also have access to, we also usually assume that you have access to the binary that more or less, so I'm attacking this binary, right? So there are some things that don't change. So basically the alignment with respect to a page offset of the instructions don't change. So that means that you don't have to scan for all the sets, but you just know a subset of sets that you know your instruction will, or the instruction you're looking for will lay on those sets.
In terms of mitigation, will frequently changing your AES key help at all?
How frequent?
I don't know, over 16 blocks, or, it's a question I should ask you, how frequently?
I think just like a few hundred rounds we can extract it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like a kilobyte, every kilobyte or something?
So what we have been observing is that, so for RSA, it's just one round, right? Or maybe 2 rounds. But for AES, we does need a few dozen to 100 rounds, but that takes pretty short amount of time too. Yeah. And I would say that's not really, good defense against this type of attack.
A good defense, for example, might be to use exponent blinding in RSA, so that ensures that, so you get, or let's say you use a different secret every time you run the algorithm, and that would prevent an attacker from doing it. But practically, we haven't seen any crypto library using this so far. So there must be a reason behind it. I don't know if performance or any other issues, but yeah, we haven't seen such a countermeasure implemented.
You consider ASLR, so does it actually make it harder for you to, let's say, use the side channel, or can you actually just break ASLR very easily by doing the side channel?
There are papers that have done it. There's an academic paper that actually broke the isolation that ASLR provides, so I would happily refer to you after the talk. In terms of attacking other stuff, not ASLR, but other, as we said, crypto things, for example, ASLR doesn't play a role. So we deal only with physical addresses, right? So ASLR doesn't really play a role in our kind of attack scenario. Right. Thank you so much for attending. And yeah, if you have further questions, you can reach us offline. Thank you.